Welcome to the meeting this morning. We'll go ahead and start. We have a very full agenda today, so I want to make sure we have enough time. Please silence your cell phones if you would, and everyone take your seats. I would also, let's see, we've got a few members that have bills that are in committee. They'll be showing up late, but I will ask the Representative Collins if you will open the in prayer.
Yes. Please pray with me. Father, I just thank you. You are such a good, good God. You are with us through all things. So we ask, and you promise to give us your wisdom if we ask. So we do. And that you will give it generously. So be with us this entire day. Walk with us. Help us be wise for the people of Alabama. And help us honor you in all that we do and say. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Thank you. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Garrett.
Here.
Representative Hill.
Here.
Representative Drummond. Representative Almond. Here. Representative Baker. Representative Chestnut. Representative Collins. Here. Representative Colvin. Representative Daniels. Representative Ellis. Here. Representative Faulkner. Representative Lawrence. Here. Representative Lovern. Representative Stubbs. Here. Representative Wood. Here. And members answering the roll.
Thank you. We do have a few members that are in other committees, and they'll be showing up soon. At the conclusion of our bills today, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Mackey and his group on an update on the numeracy task force. So at this point, let me make a mention to you in your agendas. We did have some, we're in the 20th, after the 20th day, we can give 6-hour notice. So we're trying to deal with some legislation that came up yesterday, and you received it last night. You have new packets, I think, beside you. So just make sure you're referring to the right documents. We are carrying over 2 bills. HB 466 by Representative Chris Blackshear. That bill would be carried over at his request. And at the request of Representative Daniels, we're carrying over HB 467. So we're going to go out of order a little bit here. I think first I would like to take up 2 of the simpler bills. One is the HB 445, which is in tab 7. This is a bill that I'm carrying. This is co-sponsored by Representative Baker. And this relates. This is just a word additions to words added to the Jobs Act. Remember, if in the Jobs Act we added a tourism section to that Jobs Act, and there was a question about whether the tourism language was retroactive. It didn't appear to be. Most people didn't think it was, but there were at least a couple of lawyers that read it that it could be. So what HB 445 does was make some changes, and if you look on page 3 of the bill, HB 445, there's the language which must occur after the effective date of the act, adding this language. Below that, another section after the effective date of adding this language. Down the bottom, which must occur after the effective date. On the next page, page 4, after the effective date. Number 4, another on page 4, after the effective date. And then on page 5, there's a section for projects placed into service after the effective date of this act. All this is doing is clarifying that these tax credits apply to new projects, not to existing projects. So I will entertain I'll entertain a motion for the, okay. The Representative Collins, seconded by Representative Drummond. All in favor, say aye. All opposed? Bill's given a favorable report. Thank you. The next would be in tab 6. Is that right? No, tab, let's see. Yes, HB 443. This is in tab 6. So what this bill is, this is a bill that sunsets several credits that had previously not been subject to sunset. And what we've done here is to add an amendment to this bill that basically on page 7 of the amendment, it clarifies the definitions for tax credits. The first part of the bill, which basically listed the tax credits that were sunsetting and talked about that, was no issue there. But in the latter part of the bill, there was some language dealing with reporting and other terminology about just clarity on these tax credits. We further clarifying that. So one is to clarify the definition of a tax credit. This bill, as originally filed, uses the term tax incentive. We changed that to tax credit to make sure that that's what that's all about. There was also the word in here that said that the credits had to have an annual cap. As you know, some of our credits have caps. They're not. Some of them are cumulative. They don't necessarily have to be annual. So we didn't want to codify that our credit had to have an annual cap. So we're removing that language. There was also language that limited transfer of credits to one transfer. And again, sometimes we want to allow for more than that. So we're removing that stipulation. There was also some confusing language about pre-certification with the Department of Revenue. Basically, it was kind of a redundant passage. We took that out. And then finally, the last change, there was some language that had to do with tax preference and what that meant. Tax preference, again, was a new term. We're really focused on tax credits. So this was just cleanup language that is making sure we're just sticking to what our intent was, which is sunset tax credits and make sure that any future tax credit follows the same reporting that we're doing with other tax credits, which we're doing in individual bills. So I'll entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair, I'll give it a favorable report with a question or a statement.
Okay, first we have an amendment, a question on the amendment. Entertain a motion on the amendment. Moved by Representative Drummond, second by Representative Keel. All in favor say aye. All right. Now, question about the bill.
Well, I like the fact that this bill will include a performance statement from,
Right.
as we do with all the other tax credits.
Right.
I think that's good transparency and
Right.
accountability.
Yes.
So I'll move to give the bill a favorable report.
Second by Representative Collins. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Thank you. Bill's given a favorable report. Next, we were going to do Representative Lovern, but he's not here, so we'll move to SB 67, which is in tab 2. Representative Stubbs.
Yes, Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate Senator Chambliss giving me the opportunity to carry this bill in the House. For your information, this bill did pass the Senate. There is a sub that is in your folders today. Following its passage in the Senate, there were some interested parties that gave some feedback and were able to make this a better bill, more comprehensive, and a better tool for recruitment for the Alabama National Guard. So just a recap of what this is. This stems from a situation Senator Chambliss came across in his district. There was a very successful high school student who chose to enter the National Guard, received a full academic scholarship to Auburn University, which precluded the scholarship he would have received from the Alabama National Guard. While a student at Auburn, there was one course that had to do with his flight training to potentially become a fighter pilot. It was not covered by his academic scholarship at Auburn, but then when going back to the National Guard, who, through the program we have, would have paid for his entire 4 years of school, they were not able to pay for that one class that his academic scholarship did not cover. So it was just a gap in our efforts to recruit the best and brightest in the National Guard, when another student who maybe did not receive an academic scholarship would have actually had a full scholarship through the National Guard program. So in doing that and trying to remedy that situation, there were also opportunities to incorporate dual enrollment, which at the time when the National Guard Education Assistance Program was instituted, dual enrollment wasn't really something that was happening, and so we've incorporated that in this as well. There are also a few areas where we cleaned up with regards to medically disqualified members and their exemption from repayment, and also allows for, it defines a scholarship to a private institution versus a public institution, and it sets a median tuition reimbursement if a student goes to a higher costing private institution. All the interested parties, the National Guard, the Commission of Higher Education, and the University of South Alabama was also actively involved in this because of the opportunity this provides them for recruitment, and it enhances their ability to recruit to the National Guard and their programs. Other than that, I don't know of any other specific things that are of note that we need to address. One thing I will say, this does not change the cap in the budget. So there's no change in the cap. It's just a modification of its application.
Any questions or comments from the sponsor? Representative Collins?
I want to thank you for working with all the parties, first of all, to try to get it right, and just to make sure I understand too, in the case of the example you're giving, the college student would have gotten the full scholarship to Auburn, but for that one additional course, this would allow the state to then pick up that one, and so it would kind of be a last dollar. It would fall. If they'd gotten a Pell Grant, they would get that, and it would move on down.
Absolutely. And so we're not, because we're trying to recruit the best and the brightest, we're not punishing them for getting a full scholarship on their own academically. We're actually making sure that that last dollar is covered.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Entertain a motion.
And this is a Senate sub, so just
Move to adopt sub Representative Collins. Second, Representative Keel. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Entertain a motion on the bill. Motion by Representative Colvin. Second, Representative Keel. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Bill's given favor report. Thank you. Representative Baker, SB 300, which is in tab 9 of your bill. Yeah, wherever you're more comfortable. Have you? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. Very excited about this bill. I think this will be a complement to some of the what I consider major steps we've taken, such as like with the Literacy Act and the Numeracy Act. And I feel like this is sort of in that same realm as well in regard to this particular bill, which this bill would create the School Principal Leadership and Mentoring Act. That would also include the Alabama Principal Leadership Development System. We'll draw your attention, it's within the bill. This will be on page 6, line 162, the goal of the bill. Once again, it's page 6, line 162, if you want to just follow along with that goal. On line 162, it states in item C, then the goal of the program is to increase the effectiveness of school administrators, resulting in improved academic outcomes for all students. There are several parts of the bill. With this would provide for the state superintendent to appoint a 21-member design team that would be responsible for the development of the program. This would provide that the program will be developed in 3 phases and will consist of a professional learning plan, mentor program, leadership academy, and evaluation system. It would also provide for an annual supplement program for principals and assistant principals that successfully complete the program. It would be $10,000 for principals with an additional $5,000 for serving in low-performing or high-poverty schools. It would also include $5,000 for assistant principals with an additional $2,500 for serving in low-performing or high-poverty schools. This would provide that the legislature would annually appropriate sufficient amounts to cover the actual cost. This would include awarding of stipends, grants, and also hiring professional staff. And then would also provide the state's superintendent would provide reports to the legislature at the various stages on the program development and its implementation. It's a very comprehensive bill. I'll be glad to try to dig in any way that members may have questions.
Any questions for the sponsor? Representative Collins?
I want to thank you and Senator Orr for working on this and all the other parties that have worked on this. I think that this has potential to make one of the biggest differences in our student achievement that we've ever done. I also think, as we've heard several times, that one of the biggest issues is actually discipline. And so I think that this training could actually make a huge difference with that as well. I worked with Senator Orr a good bit, and had gotten to the point that I just felt like we needed to get the right people in the room to come up with a plan. But I think it's a really good plan, and there's the design team, which I read dream team when I see it. But if we get the right ones, I know we can get evaluation and all that correct. And so I just want to thank you for the work on it. I am pleased with all the things I see and don't really have a specific question. Thank you.
Representative Wood.
Thank you.
Representative Baker, thank you for working on this. I'm just curious where the $850,000 appropriation came from, how you arrived at that, or how that
I would have to
was
defer
arrived at.
to Dustin on that, perhaps in regards to any of the figure in regards to the fiscal note. With that, it is in phases that this program, rolls out, so to speak. Dustin, would you be able to comment? I know this has come on us rather quickly.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
That was the figure that was placed in the budget. I believe the ETF budget that passed the Senate. I believe that's based off a projection of what the uptake may be. That wouldn't cover all of the principals and assistant principals that are out there, but I think that's just a kind of an estimate of potential uptake.
And within the bill, it does state the regards to the reports of what would be, those that are participating, and then the expected then for the upcoming year.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I do think this is a good piece of legislation. Principals are so critical and key to good schools, and the discipline issues are certainly can be handled with effective leadership. And I think that the focus to mentor them and help train them is better. My son, who is a teacher, and he's kind of a common sense kind of guy, although he was on Jeopardy and lost by $1, so he's pretty smart. But he told me a long time ago, he said, I've got an idea you ought to take and pass a bill. And I said, what is it? He has a lot of good ideas with bills. But this one, he said, I think that anyone who is a principal needs to go every 5 years, needs to go back 6 months and be in the classroom. And I think that everyone who wants to be an assistant principal needs to, before they do that, go shadow a principal or assistant principal for 6 months so they can see, because sometimes when you get in administration, you kind of forget what's going on in the classroom. It's kind of a common sense idea, a neat idea. Maybe the dream team can think about that one. But at least I've done my duty and I've passed that along to the legislature. That's right.
I'm really glad we're calling them the dream team now, since I am. The $850,000, I believe, is to build the mentoring program, which I think is going to be key to that. And someone else told me that. I didn't know it. But my son-in-law actually did shadow a principal before he took the assistant principal job, and decided that's not what he wanted to do right now. So I think that's very good policy.
Well, when I was on the school board, we had some great teachers, at least, that would do that when they would go be the assistant principal, and then maybe would decide after about a year, I really go back. So I think it's just the point being made. I think principals and leadership is so important anywhere. Leadership is, but in schools, they can make such a difference. So we appreciate
Thank you so much for your comments. You've made a great point then, Mr. Chairman, in regards just the principal and assistant principals then being such key figures in helping to establish the culture that's a part of a school system. In that quest for excellence and high quality, it's all a part of that. So many aspects of that. One thing I'd mention as well that seems maybe small within the bill, but it seems big to me in my mind, and that is that the elementary level, that the administrators, and this is a part of that these would be required, their professional learning would include things that would have them better skill to be able to know what effective teaching would look like in regards to the Literacy Act and also for the Numeracy Act. Sometimes it's hard to actually maybe lead in an area where you're not fully understanding. And so this, I think it's got a lot of little good components to it that really helps to accelerate, equip, and empower these administrators.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions for Representative Baker? Motion by Representative Collins, second by Representative Drummond. All in favor say aye. All opposed? Bill's given a favorable report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
See, Representative Lovern has joined us now. So, Chairman, the floor is yours. You have HB 440, which is a companion to SB 292, which is also on the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank members of the committee for being patient with me. I had an elementary school here to go speak with, and like the chairman said, I've got House Bill 440 and SB 292 companion bills, and if it's what you want to do first, we can just move the Senate bill.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's fine, and we'll carry over the 440. For SB 292 is merely a process bill. It reads as a tax exemption bill, but it's an exemption that already exists. All this does is streamline the Revenue Department process of reporting to give a simplified filing process when contractors are working for these nonprofits that qualify under this exemption. And so I would entertain any questions that you have, but this is merely a process bill to streamline, to cut out some of the red tape required.
Any questions, Representative Lovern? Representative Ellis? Motion but for favorable report, Representative Ellis. Second, Representative Daniels. All in favor, say aye. All opposed? Bills given a favorable report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Okay, that brings us now to the last bill, which is the first bill listed on the agenda here, is HB 430, which was a bill we discussed last week regarding changes to the literacy task force. Since last week, there's been a lot of discussion and among them and others, and so I'm going to actually defer at this point to Representative Stubbs. He and Representative Keel have done a lot of work on this substitute, I guess, that we're going to be discussing. So, Representative Stubbs, whatever you're more comfortable with. Okay. If it's your first time, we're supposed to haze you, but we'll forego that today.
Yeah, waiting for someone to clip my tie. So I appreciate the opportunity, and we'll address some things in this substitute for HB 430. As you recall, last week we discussed HB 430 in detail with regards to some of the modifications for the Literacy Task Force, its setup, and the application of the Literacy Task Force. So I will attempt to move through the sub and address some of the items that we discussed collectively and how those were addressed in the sub. The first and perhaps one of the greatest priorities for all of us was upon learning that the content was not evaluated by the Literacy Task Force in accordance with the law that existed. It was not their responsibility to do that. We wanted to address that, and we had some various ways of doing that, but we have settled on, if you'll look at line 40 through 42, it states that in future reviews, the task force shall add an element to the core reading and intervention program rubrics to review content for age appropriateness. And while age appropriateness for each of us may mean something a little bit different in our homes, it's our understanding that this is part of the education vernacular. It's something that they use in that world of education, and so that terminology of age appropriateness should be adequate as part of the rubric that is used by the Literacy Task Force in evaluating the vendors. The next section there that you'll see several lines, it addresses the financial component of this, which was an issue that many of our school systems were encountering by having entered into multi-year contracts with vendors that were approved under a supplemental approval in 2021-22, and many entered multi-year contracts with vendors they had been using for many years. This attempts to rectify that, make sure that they're not out any taxpayer dollars with what they're using for these programs. But I think perhaps the more important component is this gives a window of time for those vendors that have been and have served our state in many capacities for many years. It hopefully will promote their efforts to become vendors that the Literacy Task Force approves in accordance with their rubric. So I think all of us have the goal of not limiting the number of vendors to just 2. We would like that to be a much larger group. And so this provides that window of time where our schools aren't out funding, but they are able to use the vendors that they have used for many years while also encouraging those vendors to meet the rubric requirements to become fully implemented, acceptable vendors in accordance with the Literacy Task Force. Moving on, there was some discussion in the original HB 430 about modifications to the members of the Literacy Task Force, the appointing authorities, what qualifications or requirements there were. There are really no substantive changes to that list. It is the same, other than adding the director of the Alabama Reading Initiative as a voting member of the Literacy Task Force, not in an advisory capacity. It's our understanding this individual has been attending meetings, participating, but not a voting member, not in that capacity. So this adds that individual. Moving on, we did make modifications to the terms for the individuals appointed to the task force. They'll be appointed to serve a 4-year term with an additional reappointment to serve an additional 2-year term. This accomplishes 2 things. One, it allows for them in that first 4-year period to be entrenched and understand everything that's going on, become deeply involved in that, and not limit their ability to have a role on that task force. If it's just 2 years, it's kind of you're in and out, and there's not a whole lot you can do. What this also does is it allows for a staggered approach. So in future years, if someone were appointed to an additional 2-year term, the task force would be staggered in its appointments, which would allow for some continuity while also bringing in new people every 2 years rather than having a whole new group of people at one time. This does allow for reimbursements through the department for expenses incurred in the performance of their duties. And beginning in line 99 through 109, it addresses that the individual we just discussed, the director of Alabama Reading Initiative, who in this sub is a member of the Literacy Task Force. This also states that that individual shall serve as the chair. The vice chair shall be elected by the membership of the Literacy Task Force. And then there's some language here about how often they meet, the information provided to the public about when those meeting dates and times are, et cetera. There are no changes to the assessment to the from an academic perspective, the expectations, the rubric that they're using, the science of reading, all of those things are the same. We have added the age appropriateness, but we are not changing anything about science of reading. We're not changing anything about the expectations that are placed on the vendors to ensure that our children are getting the tools that they need to be successful. This is more of a structural modification to improve accountability, and also in the hopes that the law will be more clear in some of the things that we've had concerns with. So at this time, I certainly welcome any questions, and there may be others that can answer those questions as well.
One point of clarification, you may have mentioned this, but I didn't catch it on page 4 when you mentioned the 7 additional members. Again, we've gone back to the original list that was in the bill as far as appointments. We did require that at least 2 of those 7 members be teachers.
Correct. I apologize. I did overlook that. It does not change the number of task force members, but it does of the of those 7 additional members, some appointed by the student superintendent, some by the governor, at a minimum of 2 of those 7 will be K-12 teachers.
Representative Keel, do you have any thoughts or comments?
Well, excuse me, I appreciate Representative Stubbs working on this. We worked over the weekend, and, I think it's as close as we're going to get to agreeing with all parties here. But I think we made some really good changes, moved in the right direction on this to get the law, not the task force necessarily, but the law more aligned with what we were hoping to do.
Any questions for Representative Stubbs? Representative Faulkner?
Yeah, and this goes to where y'all were just talking about the. It looks like Representative Stubbs, we're still, even those 7 additional members would still be subject to the sentence and the requirement that's in the law on page 3 at the top, that each of whom shall have at least 3 years of experience with scientifically based reading instruction.
Correct.
So even those additional 7 would have that?
That is correct.
Okay. And then I noticed that you've got, in the law now, we have 2 public, number 2, well, it was number 1, but there's 2 public K through 12 teachers appointed by the executive director of the Alabama, they're appointed by the AEA there, and then 1 public K through 12 special education by the state superintendent of education. And then you had 2 public school principals. This is the existing law.
Yes.
But then we've gone back and we've added 7 additional members, but only 2 of those will be K through 12 teachers. So we'd have, if I read this, you're saying that at a minimum, we would have 4 K through 12 teachers, 2 of them appointed by the AA, and 2, at least 2, I guess I should say.
By either the governor or the state superintendent. We also have a K-12 special education teacher, so that would be 5 public education teachers.
So who do you think that provision in number 11 limits it to 2 public K through 12 teachers appointed? And it doesn't seem to suggest whether it's the governor or the state superintendent.
Well, I will say that the 7 additional members, 4 by the governor, 3 by the state superintendent, that is in existing law. So that we're not adding 7 members. The 7 members, that is in existing law.
I got you.
All we're doing
Just
is
the
trying to ensure that of those 7, 2 of those 7 are K-12 teachers, because we certainly value the boots on the ground experience that the teachers are having.
Who are these? Because currently, like you say, it is current law on the 7. Who are those other members now? Like, is it not teachers?
Well, I can't speak to that directly. I don't know. I know that they meet the requirements with regards to the 3 years of experience. I don't know who they are, and frankly, that's one of the challenges. Until I was in the room meeting with the Literacy Task Force, I didn't know who the members of the Literacy Task Force were. It's not as accessible as we would like it to be.
All right. Well, and the last thing I was going to ask, and I don't know, Chairman Garrett, you may be, members appointed to the task force shall be appointed to serve a 4-year term and may be reappointed to serve 1 additional 2-year term. I just wonder if you have some really good people, does everybody feel like that? I would hate to see somebody who's really good, and this is their passion, and this seems to indicate to me they would be limited to 6 years. And I'm not saying, if there's plenty of people available who are really into the science of reading all that, that's great. I just didn't know what y'all thought about that. Do y'all think that there's plenty of...
I do think that as time moves forward, the science of reading will become more and more pervasive in the education community. There will be more people who are becoming familiar with this, who are going to be able to meet the requirements of the background, et cetera. One thing we need to remember is, as we appoint people to a task force, they still have their jobs, right? I mean, these teachers, they're still trying to do lesson plans and all of the other things. So, it's hard to say whether 6 years of that service, they may be ready, even if they're really good, they may be ready to tap out just based on the responsibilities that accompany it. But I certainly get your point.
Yeah, I don't know if it just says, so I'm assuming that we're limiting everybody who serves on this to 6 years is the way I read that.
That is the way that this reads, is that there's not, there's only 1 2-year additional term in this current form.
Representative Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank Representative Stubbs. He met with me briefly on yesterday evening with some of the changes, but can you go to page 2 and I just want you to expound a little bit more on, in the future, the task force shall add an element in the core reading and intervention program rubrics. Can you tell me specifically what you mean there?
Can you tell me what line?
Line 40.
40. Okay. In future reviews, the task force shall add an element to the core reading and intervention rubrics to review the content for age appropriateness. So they have an existing rubric that has all the components of science of reading. And we are adding an element to that rubric that will address age appropriateness, because one of our concerns that we've heard from constituents is the content that these approved vendors, the content was getting in the classrooms, and there were a lot of concerns. I think Chairman Garrett had many people contact him regarding the content. Well, when we asked the Literacy Task Force about the content, their response, and rightfully so, it is not their responsibility to look at content in accordance with the law. Well, then we looked at, what about the textbook committee at the State Board of Education? They also were not looking at the content. So we were verifying that these vendors were meeting the rubric for science of reading, but no one was looking at the content, not the task force or the Board of Education textbook committee. And in order to address that, to make sure that as these vendors are evaluated based on the rubric, this element is being added, the age appropriateness element, which will hopefully ensure that the content that is in the science of reading materials that are being provided, that are checking all the science of reading boxes, is also age appropriate. And we're not removing anything from the rubric about science of reading, we're just adding the age appropriateness.
And I understand from talking to you that term age appropriateness is a term that is often used by the Department of Education, correct?
That is our understanding. That is.
Okay. So where in this bill, or where in the Literacy Act is that defined? What is age appropriateness?
I do not know that it's defined in the Literacy Act, but I'll yield to Chairman
I don't think
Garrett.
you do, but I mean, I guess if you think about all the first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, all the content for each of those grades is, in the educational world, age appropriate. You wouldn't put into a first grade classroom something that was age appropriate for a sixth grader. So it's a term, I think, that's understood. The point here, we want to make sure the content is that way, because some science reading, these are basically, they use a lot of stories, and sometimes the subject of those stories might be not age appropriate, and that's what we observed. So all we're saying is, do like you do every other curriculum that's recommended. There's an age appropriate standard.
So is that defined by the Literacy Task Force, or is it defined
it's not
by
defined. It's not defined. I think we assume that the education world understands what's appropriate, what's age appropriate for a first grader, what's age appropriate for a fifth grader. I mean, that's the world we are in now. We're just making sure this is applied here as they're looking at content. That's the only standard we put, was it be age appropriate.
And Representative Drummond, I would say that, and we really contemplate different ways to approach this, because it's hard to define, classify. It's hard to do that because, again, we all have our own children, grandchildren, and we may deem something age appropriate and someone else may not. But our primary objective was to make sure that someone is laying eyes on this material and has at least acknowledged the fact that this material is going to 6, 7, and 8-year-olds. And someone in this whole process has acknowledged that it's important to know that that material is sufficient or adequate for that age group. And that allows us to, because currently we have no one is looking at it. It is arriving in the classroom, and we cross our fingers.
And I think this is a reason to add the teachers to it, because I think teachers who are in the classroom are going to know what's age appropriate. I think teachers, just by their nature, are going to be more focused on the content than maybe other people would be. So I think that's the reason. One of the justifications for adding teachers to this group would be they will help us determine that's really not age appropriate. That is, because sometimes some of us my age forget what's age appropriate, right? So this is.
Well, see, I have a 7-year-old granddaughter, and I can tell you that she is so far beyond her years, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So, and I'm not saying that I want her to be taught anything that was not age appropriateness, but she's a bright young kid, and I always want her to be challenged, and when she's not challenged, that's when I know she gets into trouble. Because her mind is just so accelerated. My last question.
Yes, ma'am.
I know that one of the things that our chair wanted to look at as well, and I'm sure this is why you add the director of the Alabama Reading Initiative, and in existing law, who is that person answerable to, or who will she be answerable to as it relates to these changes?
The director of the Alabama Reading Initiative is appointed by the state superintendent of education. They are an employee of the State Department of Education. Again, that individual currently has been actively engaged with the Literacy Task Force. I would say maybe in an advisory role, participating in the meetings, following more, I guess, in a role of implementation of what comes out of the task force. But from an accountability perspective, in our view, the way the Literacy Task Force was set up on December 1st, 2019, which was part of the Literacy Act directed, and the Literacy Task Force was established by the state superintendent. That Literacy Task Force vets and evaluates all of these different vendors, but when the final product comes out of that Literacy Task Force, in terms of after the RFP, after the evaluations, after the rubrics, when that final product comes out, that is the law. That is, it is something that our school systems are expected to comply with, or they will not be able to use state dollars for those vendors.
Okay, now this is my last question, because the State Department of Education will verify all of those members of the task force, right?
Correct.
And they meet certain criteria,
The
teachers
3 years
whatsoever.
of experience. Yes, ma'am.
The person who we have as the director of the Alabama Reading Initiative, is that person also verified, and will it be public what that person's qualifications are?
I would assume so. It's already public what that person's qualifications are in terms of their.
Well, I'm talking about in relationship to this particular piece of legislation.
In terms of their background?
Yes, sir. Everybody else's will be verified, and
Yes.
their credentials will be checked. And since, will the members of the task force have a say into who that individual is, or if their qualifications meet all criteria that we're looking for?
Their qualifications will be expected to meet the same criteria in terms of the 3 years of experience, but their qualifications with regards to that person is appointed by the state superintendent. So the task force members, there will be held to the same standard in terms of work or experience, but that individual will serve as the chairman. And, also as we've got here, all task force meetings and subcommittee meetings shall be publicly posted along with a complete listing of all task force members, which as we've stated, the Department of Education is going to verify their experience to make sure they satisfy those qualifications. But we also will know who are the members of the task force. And that individual in that position will also meet those same requirements.
Representative Almond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do also want to reiterate my thanks to you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Stubbs, Mr. Keel, Mr. Baker, and Ms. Collins for all of your work this past week on this bill and taking time to educate me on it. I do have one question about the assessments. I want to make clear. So currently, what we're saying is we have 3 years to continue using the vendors we're using, whether they meet the standards of the task force or not. I guess that's the question.
Okay, so the task force was created in 2019. Then the pandemic arrived and maybe caused some slowdown in the implementation. But the task force approved 2 vendors initially. Well, in that same, in 2021, 2022, there was a supplemental list of vendors that were eligible to be used that was provided by Dr. Mackey. Many of the school systems were using one of those 3 that were approved by Dr. Mackey. Well, school systems entered into multi-year contracts, some of them, and because they had been using those vendors for some time. So now during that year, you had 5. You had the 2 from the task force, and then you had the 3. Well, fast forward to where we are now, the same 2, again, approved by the Literacy Task Force, no new added. So what we're hoping is that during this window of time, the 3 that some of our school systems are using that were originally approved in 2021, 2022, my ultimate goal is for the task force to meet with them, answer all of their questions, do everything possible to raise the bar so that they will fulfill all the requirements of the rubric so that they will become approved by the Literacy Task Force. If we can get to that point, it solves a lot of issues, and I think that's the direction we're going. We just want to ensure that in this gap time while these school systems are in multi-year contracts, they're not having to use local dollars to fulfill their financial obligation for the contracts because of the difference in the 2 from the task force and 3 from the supplemental list.
Thank you. And just to be clear, though, just because we're, I'll say, grandfathering in or allowing the contracts to continue for the next 3 years, it is our expectation that at that time, whenever the next round of approvals comes out, that even though these vendors have been allowed to continue, we will expect that they will have to meet the standards.
Right, and if they don't, then they're no longer going to be eligible for use using state dollars by the school systems. I will say that the way the task force has the ability to add vendors every year, but once they add a vendor, that vendor stays on the list for 3 years. And that's, continuity. I mean, implementing a new vendor is a process. It's training for teachers, it's administrators, it's a lot of things. So it's not something you can just change on a whim. And so what we're hoping is that during that window, the task force will take the time to meet with the vendors who plan to make a presentation to be accepted, do a pre-RFP meeting, do a seminar, show them exactly what you're looking for, and then hopefully they will make the modifications that they need to in their respective programs, and then they'll meet the rubric expectations of the task force.
Thank you.
So.
Any other questions? Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have just a couple of items. This is on page 2, line 36, and this is in references the annual list that would be vetted, and it says and approved. Well, I'm curious why "and approved" has been struck. That we have elsewhere within this where vetted and approved is used, like on line 45, and then I think elsewhere there's one other spot in the bill that it does. I was just curious as to why, because vetted is an action. It doesn't necessarily mean approved. I mean, so it could, vetted could be that it's.
Right. So I think, and I may be incorrect, and I'll yield to Chairman Garrett or others, but vetted, a list of vetted assessments would be the ones that are being evaluated, or the ones that have made a proposal and are being vetted. Vetted and approved would, in my interpretation, would mean that they have been vetted and they've been approved.
Right.
So this is showing these are the ones that were vetted. These are the ones that made a proposal that wanted to be evaluated for consideration. And then moving down to line 45, the vetted and approved list, which would then be the list that actually made it through the vetting and received the final approval, those will remain in force for that 3-year period.
Yeah, I understand on that part. Thank you for that explanation. But I'm still going back up on line 36 and actually get 35, which says the annual list of vetted. And so if we say just vetted assessments that are valid and reliable, so I mean, so why are we vetting? I mean, then why do we remove approved on that? I mean, I don't quite understand.
Does anyone have a response to that? I can't answer that.
I think our intent, isn't it, for them to be vetted and approved? Isn't that the intent on the annual list?
I do think that's the intent, and this may not be addressing that, but I think it's also important for us to know who were the bidders, who were the vendors who sought approval, because in some of the feedback we received, and obviously there's always two sides to the story, but some we've received is that vendors have submitted applications and not received the feedback. So then they come back the next year and they're kind of going against a brick wall. Now I can't say whether that is what it is or not, but knowing who was vetted, so who actually went through the RFP process, what 8 vendors attempted to be approved, and then which 2 were approved.
In my mind, that's transparency. In my mind, I mean, because a lot of times rather than just saying, rather than saying, here's who we approved, like I'm just looking at it from I guess with my contract review hat on. A lot of times we just get a list of who's approved. We always have to ask, well, how many applied? How many did this? Big. Okay. So I think you're just getting information because they don't move forward unless they're approved, but it's just letting people know. That was my perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That maybe clears up some of my confusion on that. So what you're expecting maybe is that this would be some, as you just mentioned, said transparency. Then so this would not just be a vetted.
Well, I'll give you an example. This doesn't really apply to this, but like for example, in contract review, all the time we'll get a contract from a vendor in Minnesota to do something. We'll go, why don't we contract somebody in Minnesota? Can nobody in Alabama do this? And sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes it's You're trying to just figure out, we want to be above board. We want to have everything transparent. We want to make sure, and that's part of the reason for the accountability provisions is to make sure that we don't get situation and while we only have perennially one provider or vendor. That just doesn't work well in the state government, right?
Well, that explains a lot then, the transparency maybe that's desired, so that it be a listing then of all, whether they be the approved or not, but just the vetted list. So that does make more sense to me.
Well, and I'll speak to, my experience as the chairman of the county commission for 6 years. Early on, I had a lot of people who were bidding for projects say, I never win a bid. I never, nobody ever gives us a shot, that type of thing. And so what we started to do was we started to have pre-bid meetings where we brought everybody together. We told them exactly what was expected so that no one had any minor mistakes in their application that would have thrown them out. And what resulted was instead of having 1 or 2 successful bidders, we started having 5 or 6, which allowed us, it certainly benefited the taxpayer because we had more people bidding, but it also gave people more opportunities for success. And I hope that this, kind of follows suit in terms of helping these vendors get across the finish line. I believe that these vendors, I mean, this is their business, so they want our business. They want our school system's business. So I would have to assume that they will do all that they can to make the necessary changes to satisfy their customers, who are the school systems of Alabama, assuming we provide them with all of the tools necessary to be successful. And
that is my desire as well. And that one final question, if I may, on this. I appreciate all that have been a part of this work, somewhat behind the scenes in terms of trying to refine the process. That's not uncommon at all for us to try to refine legislation going forward. One of the things I know that's been brought forth was about the accountability of the literacy task force as to whom they were accountable to. I guess that's just sort of a general question that's sort of been out there. And so I guess I would ask this question sort of twofold then. So the literacy task force under existing then legislation, then they're accountable to who now?
That's a great question.
Okay, so, now with this legislation, the literacy task force will be accountable to who?
Well, I would say that in attempting to stay with the spirit of the literacy task force, which I've spoken with Representative Collins about, and I agree with the fact that at times it can get really muddy and really challenging dealing with bureaucracy and all of the other things that accompany it. And so it's my impression that the construct of the literacy task force was to remove itself from all of that. And in so doing, the science of reading and all of these things with all of these experts, they've done a tremendous job of doing that. On the other side of it is it's one thing for a task force to use all of the tools that they have and make recommendations, and those recommendations then are vetted by someone they're accountable to for final approval. Or we as a legislative body are tasked with appropriating dollars. We have essentially yielded our authority to appropriate dollars to this group because when they make their final approval following the rubric that they have set forth, and hopefully our addition of age appropriateness, when they determine which vendors satisfy all of those things, that is now not alterable. It is not. It can be viewed, but it is not something that can be changed. And then it goes so far as to say, if you do not use one of these vendors that we, the Literacy Task Force, have approved, you have to use local dollars instead of state dollars for the contracts that you're entering into. And so from an accountability and transparency perspective, that is, the challenge that I personally am having is my familiarity with task force is they go off, they do a ton of research, they provide a report, and then that report is evaluated and decisions are made by the decision makers. That's not the case in its current form.
So I think if I may interrupt, I think what's going to happen here, if the chair of the task force is the ARI director, who's a state employee, and the task force does something that we find out, upsets or whatever, and we then can go to Dr. Mackey and say, what's going on? Why is right now, we had to do that, we're doing this.
So is the change then, so I guess my question then, Mr. Chairman, to that then, so existing then, the literacy task force is not accountable to the state school superintendent?
No.
But with this now,
the chair of the committee is we're not even saying that, but the chair of the task force is an employee, and we can at least have a venue to say, for a discussion.
We're not removing the task force ability to still do what we just talked about.
The other way you could do it, you could say we're going to leave the structure the way it is, but all their recommendations have to go to the State Department and they have to approve those. And we thought because otherwise, nobody, if they do something we don't like, there's no way to challenge it. Or so,
That process doesn't change, though, does it? It still goes to the state school superintendent for these recommendations that come from.
No, the recommendations they make go to him, but he has to do them. He can't. There's no ability for him to reject them or modify them.
Well, I thought they were modified going back to the 3 that he added earlier that was mentioned. Because that was not the recommendation of the task force, but we mentioned the 3 that were added.
Right, in 2021, 2022. And I can't speak to exactly how that occurred. I assume it was in response to the pandemic and in response to federal dollars that were coming down through. But then the following year, those were removed.
How did he get that power?
Dr. Mackey, can you address that?
Thank you, Mr. Stubbs. So that year, actually, the assessments came along before there was a Literacy Act or a Literacy Task Force. That's what happened. So we had both in the budget language, you guys gave us money for math and early childhood math and literacy assessments. We started that process of vetting the assessments using department staff before the Literacy Act even passed. So we had this bigger list of 6. Then when the Literacy Task Force was established and the law says that they vet assessments, I was trying to marry these 2 processes up because we already had a vetted list, but it hadn't been released yet, and we had the task force wanting to vet, and we had to do something in a big hurry. So what I said was we would release the full list of 6 that had been vetted and approved by early childhood specialists for math and reading. Of course, at that time we didn't have a Numeracy Act, but we would let the Literacy Task Force vet the lists that had already been vetted, and if they didn't agree with all 6, they could say, here are the 6, but we prefer 3. And we lived with that the first 2 years, and then we entered the pandemic, so we kind of stayed in that. There was a lot of pushback, and some of you and others got upset with me about that. And so we said, well, once we get out of the pandemic and once this first 2 years are over, then we will turn the whole process, the department won't do a vetting anymore. We'll turn the whole process over to the Literacy Task Force. And that's where we are now. And as this year, there are 2, I think, on the list. And we send out a memo, whatever they vet, that's what we do now. We are following the current law. But the reason we had 6 is because that original list was vetted before there even was a Literacy Task Force. And now we're trying to marry those things, where we did marry those things together, and now we're back to the current law.
Right. Thank you for that explanation. Yes. Yeah, so I understand there was that transition period, so I'm not faulting any of the decisions necessarily made in that transition period and such. I guess I'm trying to pinpoint a little bit in regards both from an accountability of the task force and who the task force would be accountable to, but as well any of the authority or power structure to stray from what they might have recommended, which going forward, I didn't know if that would be an authority that would be able to be exerted.
Well, all I would say, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Baker, and Mr. Stubbs, sorry, I don't want to take your time, but they remember that first vetting was done before the Literacy Act passed. So the Literacy Act says vet the assessment for these things. Remember, that list didn't exist in the first vetting. So it's nobody's fault. Nobody on the Literacy Task Force, nobody at the department, that there was a larger list. They were using a different set of criteria or a different rubric. And then once the Literacy Act passed, we shifted to the rubric in the Literacy Act.
Yep. Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you also, Representative Stubbs and Keel, for working with us all weekend. I know we made lots of changes up until late last night, so I appreciate all of those. I do want to say the list of the task force members is on the website, and I've been sent a copy of those 2 pages. If anybody wants to see them, happy to share. I know I spoke with to Representative Drummond's point on the content and age appropriateness. Dr. Mackey and several of the people from the department met with me, and he even said that we might look into having, not codifying, but having the textbook committee also look at content, and that the age appropriateness was at least a used term it's still probably not completely defined, but I wanted to let everybody know where there was. I wanted to say a couple of things. On page 4, lines 107 through 109, the task force members, when they're reviewing RFPs, it's like other things. There's a lot of non-disclosures and all, and I have a little concern if that part's even possible. And so I think we might want to look at that as we move forward.
What part is that?
It's lines 107 through 109, and it's about the meetings publicly posted and go along with the complete listing of the task force members are there already. But I'm just not sure. I know in the past they've had to have media, and I'll step out of that room when they were actually reviewing the process. So I just think we need to check into that. That's my concern. But my real concern and last thing is on page 2, lines 42 through 49, and I mentioned that, and I know we had some language that we had offered last week and that y'all have come back and offered this. I guess my concerns here are that those that maybe are not meeting our current science of reading standards actually have one more year when I do my math than the ones that do meet. I do have a little concern about that. And I also, while I share your hope and your assumption that everyone wants to meet it, I also like to make sure we have in language, and I want to create that sense of urgency that, yes, we're going to use the 2 approved right now for a time period. We are going to continue to allow, just like the task force recommended, those that are in a contract to complete that, but to have language that encourages them to live to the science of reading so that they are approved. Those are the things that are my main concerns with this. And I don't have a recommendation except for to continue looking at it and working together as it moves forward. But I mainly want to say I appreciate all the cooperation that y'all have had, and at the appropriate time would move to adopt the sub.
Motion to adopt the sub. Is there a second? Second for Representative Almond. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Entertain a motion now. On
Move
the
we
bill.
adopt the bill.
Moved by Representative Keel. Second, Representative Almond. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
I'm sorry. Yes, sure.
There was a Washington Post article that just came out, and it talked about actually Mississippi's, Louisiana, Alabama's, and Florida's literacy, and was very proud of how it's doing. They pointed out that as of last year, Alabama, 1/5 of students still are not reading at grade level, but that the evidence still suggests that these states made promising gains for low-income students. In particular, in 2019, Alabama ranked 49th in our NAEP reading scores for low-income 4th graders. But in 2022, it ranked 27th, even amid the pandemic where most states saw losses. That's my main concern about changing, is that it's working, and
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
it's my concern. Thank you.
We have a second. Second by Representative Colvin. All in favor of adopting the bill as substituted say aye. Aye. All opposed? Bill's given a favor report. Thank you, members. Thank you for your robust discussion, too. I want to say this, too, that this is a committee that needs to have discussion. We need to vet things. We need to vet a lot of the tax credits and things that come before us with the equal enthusiasm. So I appreciate your diligence on that. Dr. Mackey, we're going to defer this discussion just because of that. Appreciate you guys coming here. We do want to have an update on the numeracy task force, though. We're very interested in the progress, so we'll do that before we adjourn for the session. Also, I want to let the members know that next week we will plan to take up the budget. The Senate plans to take up the general fund budget, and then we will have, the plan would be to have our budget on the floor, education budget in the House on Thursday, and the Senate would have the general fund on Thursday as well. That means that between now and that time, I owe you a lot of information, so we'll be working on that. We've had some discussion, but we'll be getting more. Also, the plan would be next week in committee, in addition to all of the budget bills, we'll also be looking at the grocery tax bill, which was filed yesterday, and we will be doing a substitute, which I'll get to you before the next day or so. So next week, budget and grocery tax. And a lot of information in between there. So any other comments or questions? If not, thank you for your attendance. We're adjourned. Sure, absolutely.